Everybody, it's Sandy and welcome back to my channel dedicated to helping you advocate for your own health one topic at a time. So guys, today I want to talk about the infection rate. Like how much higher is it really than we know? Yes, guys, this is something that I touched on a little bit in a previous video where I talked about a study that was done at Cape Town, South Africa, in which they determined that we really should be using saliva tests and not the nasal swabs to diagnose Omicron, and that in fact the PCR test using the nasal swab will result in some false negatives. Now, I haven't heard almost anybody speak about this and its potential impact on the numbers that we are recording right now, but for a variety of reasons, that being one of them, I'm sure that our infection rate is significantly undercounted. Now, I thought maybe we're missing 20% or an extra, 25% of infections that we're not catching. Now, I recently heard Scott Gottlieb, the former FDA commissioner, and he's on the board of Pfizer, and I heard him say that he thinks that we are only counting 10% of the cases. And I just shudder to think that's true, but I haven't heard him speak about this issue of the nasal PCR versus a saliva test. Now, I can't imagine that we're doing any worse than only counting 10%. So maybe he's including that potential issue, but I really haven't heard our public figures talk about that. There's a lot of talk about how the home tests are less accurate now that we have Omicron and that it seems to evade the home test somewhat. But they say that if you have a negative home test and you are sick, then you should still follow up with a PCR. But what they don't go on to say is that the PCR is indisputably less accurate than it was with previous variants. So I personally know several people now, like who doesn't, who have gotten COVID in recent weeks. Every single one of them who got it confirmed with a PCR had more than one PCR. I think the lowest number was three PCRs, and two people I know, it was 1 out of 4 PCRs that came back positive. I suspect there's something about the day you catch it. Maybe there's not enough viral load up in the nares to catch it on a PCR on a certain day after infection. I'm not sure what that's about, but when I look around and I see the anecdotal evidence around me and how many times people have gotten PCR tests only to get one positive test out of 3 or 4 when they're sick, well, that tells me that there are plenty of people walking around who had a PCR test because they felt they had cold symptoms, and then they feel they have ruled it out because they got a negative PCR and they stopped testing. In fact, I would think the overwhelming majority of people who have cold symptoms do that. Most people are not going to sign up for more than one PCR. Frankly, a lot of people can't even get a PCR to begin with. So I am convinced that a large percentage of people walking around now who have colds, and even a very large, if not almost all people walking around with cold symptoms who say that they have ruled out because they got a negative PCR are in fact positive for COVID. So there are a number of obvious reasons why we would expect that the numbers that we have are falsely low. And in fact, the cases are being undercounted. The most obvious one is that not everybody can get a test. So in some areas, the testing is so backlogged that when you go to sign up for a test, they don't even have one for several days. I mean, by that time you might be negative. Some people just give up. Some people wait in lines and, for hours and hours, and they run out of testing materials or whatever, and the site closes for the day. People often can't get tests, and even people who can get tests, I suspect it's often not on one of the days where there's enough viral load to shed that they're going to find a positive PCR. Secondly, there's a lot of people who don't test. So if you had an exposure and the next day you come down with symptoms yourself, maybe you're not going to bother going to get a test. You can just assume that this is COVID. So there's a certain number of people that just aren't going to test. If it's going through a household, if it's going through a family, there's probably not much need to go about repeated testing. It's probably exhausting to even try to do so. Some people are lucky enough to get an accurate positive on a home test. I do know somebody that's happened to, so when the home test is positive, first of all, there's really almost no such thing as a false positive. Theoretically, is it possible? Yes, it would mean that a sample was contaminated with the same RNA. You have to have RNA from the virus in order to have a positive test. So a false positive is just almost unheard of. If you have a test turned positive, you can assume you have COVID. A false negative, not so much. There might not be enough for it to show. There might not be a good enough sample that you've produced. So negative, I don't believe really is, especially these days, is that convincing of ruling out an infection. but a false positive is almost unheard of. So there are some cases where the home test turns positive, which I guess is better than having to go drag yourself out to a testing site these days. But then those tests don't get counted, right? Because you're just in your home. You're not then going to follow up with a PCR and put yourself through that just because that's going to go to the health department and get counted. So there's a number of people that aren't being counted because of that. And then finally, like I said a moment ago, for a number of reasons, people can get a negative test, but they're still positive. They get a false negative. So if you had it on the wrong day, you didn't get a good sample. You know, the same things that are possible with the home test are possible with the PCR. And while the PCR is still more reliable than the home tests by far, you know, I'm just convinced that these days a huge percentage of the population producing a negative PCR result really, in fact, does have COVID. In fact, I would go so far as to say there's almost no such thing as a cold these days. Like, do I have a cold? No, you have COVID. I think it's going to be interesting to see after this wave is over if people who weren't sure go get like nucleocapsid tests, the antibody test that can tell if you had the virus, and it can discriminate between immunity from the virus versus immunity from a vaccine. I really think it would be an interesting study. I'm sure somebody's going to study this and see, you know, what percentage of people that had negative PCRs and concluded that they did not have COVID, that in fact then turned positive on a nucleocapsid antibody test. So here's what I'm doing, and here's what I'm going to recommend. Now I'm going to insert my usual disclaimer, which is that I'm not giving any individual medical advice on this channel. Nothing that I say should be deemed a substitute for the advice of your own qualified practitioner. And of course, you should seek the advice of your own qualified practitioner. But I think that it is prudent to assume that if you have any kind of cold symptoms at all right now, in light of the Omicron variant circulating around at the level that it is, I think it's prudent to assume that you have COVID, in fact, regardless of the results of even a PCR test. That's personally how I'm going to handle it in my life, and people that I love are going to handle it, the people who listen to me. So I would be interested to hear if anybody has any experience with this. Yeah, I wish there was more discussion right now. I think it needs to be much more widely understood that even the PCR with the Omicron variant is less reliable than it was with other variants in the past. So even though the PCR is still the gold standard and trumps the at-home test, the rapid antigen tests, and even the rapid PCRs, the rapid PCR, even though it is a kind of a PCR, you give up some of the sensitivity in favor of the speed. But even the gold standard PCR, because we're using the nasal swab, it is not as reliable as it was with previous variants. I really think that needs to be discussed. So let me know if you guys have had any experience with this, or if you know of anybody. I know of several people who have concluded they just have colds because they took a PCR and it was negative. I'm not getting anywhere near them. Yeah, so in the meantime, I hope you guys stay safe. Please bear this in mind when you're determining who you're going to get near. Be careful, and until next time, be well. Bye-bye.